17 years ago, he pulled a starving child off a cold sidewalk. Today, that same empire he built with his bare hands hangs by a single thread, and everything is about to change.
She was found sleeping in a doorway with nothing but a torn blanket. No one believed a broken girl like her could ever amount to anything.
The men who once shook his hand now wanted his name erased from the very company he built from nothing. One signature was all that stood between him and total ruin. No one on that board expected the one person who could still save him, the little girl he once saved, to walk through those doors and change everything.
For 17 years, he gave her a home. Today, in the place he feared the most, she was about to give him back everything he had ever given her.
Marcus Reed never planned to save anyone. He was 40 years old, exhausted from a 16-hour shift managing 3 failing construction sites. And he only stopped his truck at the corner of 5th and Miller because the rain had turned the intersection into a small lake, and he did not want to hydroplane through it. That was the only reason he saw her. A small girl, maybe 6 years old, curled against the base of a shuttered pharmacy, a garbage bag pulled over her shoulders like a coat, her bare feet blue with cold. If you have ever wondered what one decision made in the rain can do to the rest of a man's life, stay with this story until the end, because what happened 17 years later inside a downtown courtroom will remind you why kindness is never wasted. And if this story moves you even a little, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be seen by more than just the two of us. Marcus grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above his mother's hair salon on the south side of the city, the kind of childhood where you learned early that nothing was given to you twice. He put himself through a community college business program during the day and swept floors at a hardware store at night. And by the time he was 32, he had scraped together enough to open a small property renovation company with 4 employees and 1 dented pickup truck. He was good at reading buildings the way other people read faces. He could walk into a condemned brownstone and see in his mind exactly how it would look restored, and investors began to trust that vision. By the time he was 40, Reed Development Group had grown into a company with 80 employees and a reputation for taking neighborhoods other developers had written off and giving them back their pride. He had also, somewhere in the climb, lost his marriage. His wife left when their son was 2. Unable to live inside a life that revolved entirely around blueprints and deadlines, and she took their son back to Ohio with her. Marcus sent money every month and called every Sunday, but the distance between them only grew, and by the time the boy turned 10, the calls became shorter, and by the time he was 15, they stopped answering at all. Marcus told himself he still had his work, his purpose, and that would be enough. He told himself that on the night he found the girl in the rain, too. He did not analyze the decision. He simply got out of his truck, took off his own jacket, and knelt down in front of her. She flinched so violently that she nearly toppled sideways, and it was that flinch more than anything else that told him everything he needed to know about the life she had lived so far. He did not touch her. He asked her name, and after a long, weary silence, she whispered it. Amara. He asked where her mother was, and she said nothing at all, which he later learned meant her mother had been gone for months, taken by an overdose in a shelter 3 blocks away, and no relative had come forward to claim the child left behind. He called the police that night not to have her taken away, but because he did not know what else a man was supposed to do with a shivering 6-year-old on a street corner. What he did not expect was for the officer to tell him that the nearest emergency placement was 2 counties away, that the system was overwhelmed, and that if he was willing, there was an emergency temporary guardianship process that could keep her somewhere safe and warm that very night while paperwork caught up. Marcus looked down at Amara, who had fallen asleep sitting up against the pharmacy wall out of sheer exhaustion, and he said yes before he had time to be afraid of what yes would cost him. The first year was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than building a company from nothing. Amara did not speak for the first 4 months. She hid food in her pockets and under her pillow because some part of her still did not believe there would be a next meal. She screamed if a door closed too loudly. She would not sleep unless a light was left on in the hallway. And even then, Marcus would often find her at 2 in the morning sitting upright in the corner of her room, watching the door, waiting for someone to take this temporary softness away from her, the way everything else in her life had been taken. He learned patience he did not know he had. He learned to sit on the floor outside her door for hours without saying a word, just so she would know someone was there. He hired a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and he rearranged his entire business schedule around her school hours, missing board meetings and turning down contracts that required travel, something his partners at the time did not understand and resented him for. Slowly, so slowly that he almost missed it happening, Amara began to speak in full sentences. She began to laugh at his terrible jokes. She began to run to him at the end of the school day instead of walking with her head down. On the day the adoption was finalized, when she was 7 years old, she asked the judge, in a small, clear voice, if she could change her last name to his, and Marcus had to leave the courtroom for 5 minutes because he could not stop the sound that came out of him when she said it. Amara grew up inside Reed Development Group the way other children grow up inside their parents' passions. She spent her weekends in hard hats walking through half-finished buildings, asking Marcus why a load-bearing wall could not simply be moved, absorbing his patient explanations the way other children absorbed cartoons. By the time she was in high school, she had decided, with the same fierce, quiet determination that had once kept her alive on a street corner, that she wanted to protect people the way Marcus had protected her, and she chose law. Marcus paid for none of her law school out of guilt or obligation, but because he was, without question, the proudest father any daughter has ever had, and he told her that every single time she called him nervous about an exam. She graduated in the top of her class and took a position at a mid-sized firm downtown that specialized in corporate and construction law, deliberately choosing a field close enough to her father's world that she would always understand what he was building, but far enough that she would build her own name first, on her own terms, before ever working directly for him. The trouble at Reed Development Group began quietly, the way most real trouble does. Marcus had brought on 2 minority partners 8 years earlier, men named Harold Voss and Dennis Cole, to help finance the company's expansion into commercial real estate, and for years the arrangement worked well. But 2 years before the story's climax, a downturn in the commercial market combined with a series of delayed permits on a major riverside development left the company over-leveraged, and Voss and Cole began to see an opportunity not to save the company, but to seize it. They quietly bought up debt the company owed to smaller lenders, consolidated it, and began maneuvering behind closed doors to force a vote of no confidence against Marcus as CEO, using the company's temporary financial strain as their justification. Though their real motivation was far simpler, they wanted full control of the riverside property, which had quietly tripled in projected value once the city announced a new transit line nearby. They fabricated a narrative that Marcus had mismanaged funds, hired an aggressive law firm, and filed for an emergency shareholder hearing that would, if it went their way, strip Marcus of his position and his majority voting shares within the company he had built from a single dented pickup truck. Marcus did not tell Amara at first. He did not want her carrying his burdens the way he had once, unknowingly, asked a small child to carry the weight of his long work hours. But she found out anyway, the way daughters who pay attention always do, when she noticed him staring blankly at a stack of unopened mail one evening at dinner, his hands trembling slightly around his coffee cup. She asked him directly, and when he finally told her everything, the fabricated mismanagement claims, the emergency hearing, the very real possibility that he could lose the company and his name attached to every building he had ever restored, something in her went very still and very focused. The exact same stillness he remembered from the night he found her in the rain, right before she decided to trust him. She told her firm she needed to take personal leave. She spent the next 11 days doing what she did best, reading every contract, every amendment, every filing with the same relentless attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected young associates at her firm. What she found, buried in an addendum from 4 years earlier that Voss and Cole had clearly hoped no one would ever read closely again, was a clause explicitly protecting Marcus's founding majority shares from forced dilution under any circumstances except proven criminal fraud. A protection Marcus himself had forgotten existed, negotiated by a young associate attorney during the original partnership agreement. An associate who, as Amara discovered with her heart pounding, had been a favor called in by her own late professor from law school, meaning the very protection that could save her father had been placed there unknowingly, years before she had ever chosen to become a lawyer, as if some part of the universe had been preparing her for this exact morning all along. During those 11 days, Amara barely slept. She spread the entire history of Reed Development Group across the floor of her apartment, color-coded by year, cross-referencing every amendment against every filing the company had ever made. Because she understood something Voss and Cole never accounted for, they had assumed the daughter of a construction man would skim the surface of legal language the way most people did, nodding along at things they did not fully understand. They had not counted on someone who had spent her entire childhood being taught, patiently and deliberately, to see the load-bearing walls hidden inside things that looked, on the surface, like nothing at all. She called her old law school professor's widow late one night, not expecting much, only hoping for a name, and the widow remembered exactly which associate her late husband had recommended for the original partnership filing all those years ago. A young man who had since become a respected judge himself, and who confirmed, in a brief and startled phone call, that the protective clause had indeed been drafted deliberately, at her professor's insistence, because he believed self-made men like Marcus Reed were too often stripped of what they built the moment they needed protecting the most. Amara sat on her apartment floor after that call for a long time, staring at the clause, understanding for the first time that the very thread of her own life, the professor who trained her, the path that led her to corporate law, the specific firm she had chosen so she could understand her father's world, had somehow, improbably, been leading back to this exact document all along. She did not tell Marcus what she found until the morning of the hearing, because she wanted to be absolutely certain, and because some quiet part of her wanted this moment to be hers to give him, the way he had once given her a home without asking for anything in return. Marcus walked into the courthouse that morning believing he might walk out with nothing left of the empire he had built, prepared to accept it with whatever dignity he had left, because he had learned, 17 years earlier, that dignity was sometimes the only thing you got to keep. He sat at the defense table across from Voss and Cole, who did not even look at him, so certain were they of their victory. The judge began reviewing preliminary statements, and then the courtroom doors opened, and Amara Reed walked in, not as his daughter that day, but as licensed co-counsel, filing an emergency motion to introduce the original partnership addendum into evidence. Her voice steady and clear as she laid out, clause by clause, exactly why the entire hearing was built on a foundation that legally could not hold. Voss's attorney objected repeatedly. The judge overruled him each time. Within 40 minutes, what had been positioned as a certain and swift removal of Marcus Reed from his own company collapsed into a stunned, humiliated silence at the plaintiff's table, and the judge dismissed the emergency motion in its entirety, preserving Marcus's full majority control. Outside on the courthouse steps afterward, in front of the same reporters who had gathered that morning expecting to cover the fall of a self-made man, Marcus did not talk about the company, or the shares, or the Riverside development that was now safely his to finish. He put his arm around his daughter, the woman who had once been a nameless child wrapped in a garbage bag on a freezing sidewalk, and he told the cameras, in a voice thick with something he did not try to hide, that 17 years ago he thought he was the one doing the saving, and that he had spent every year since being proven wrong, because the truth was that she had been saving him right back the entire time, one Sunday dinner, one graduation, one quiet, unshakable act of loyalty at a time, and that no board, no lawsuit, and no amount of money could ever come close to what she had already given him just by staying. A reporter asked Amara, almost as an afterthought, how it felt to walk into that courtroom knowing what was at stake, and she answered simply that she had grown up watching a man who had never once treated an act of kindness like a transaction, who had never once reminded her of what he had done for her or expected anything in return for it, and that the only thing she had ever wanted, from the moment she understood what he had given up to raise her, was the chance to prove that his kindness had not been wasted on a girl who would forget where she came from. Voss and Cole quietly resigned from the board within the month, selling their remaining shares back to the company at a modest loss. And neither man ever spoke publicly about the case again. Reed Development Group finished the Riverside project 18 months later, and Marcus insisted the building carry a small plaque near its entrance, one that mentioned no company names or dates, only a single line, "To the ones who show up in the rain." And whenever people asked him what it meant, he would simply smile, look toward his daughter, and say that it was a very long story, and that it was, without question, the best decision he ever made.